Hello BookTube, it's Roz here for a scallydandle, and we're going to Timor Leste in the company of Luis Cardoso, who wrote The Crossing. Now, about 3 weeks ago, I did a video about my kind of scallydandling project, as I call it, to read things from by authors from every country in the world if I can. And I said, can anyone help me to find interesting books to read from the countries that I haven't been to yet? There's about 35 of them. And wonderfully, people came up with suggestions. And one of those people was Isa Oliva, who's a BookTube commenter who's Portuguese and lives now in Germany. And she suggested this book, which is a book from, say, Timor Leste, which was a former Portuguese colony. And she had a copy of it in Portuguese and said, you get a copy in English for us. I think it exists, you can. And let's do it as a buddy read, which we did, which was a joy for me because she was reading it in the original Portuguese. So some of those nuances of translation that you get, when it's like, oh, does this make sense? She was able to enlighten me, and also she brought a whole kind of depth of context around sort of Portuguese history and the Portuguese relationship between Portugal and its imperial possessions like East Timor that really enriched the read. So that was just a wonderful thing. Now, if you're thinking at the moment, Timor Leste, where is that? You can be forgiven because it's only been a kind of sovereign independent nation since 2002. So it's one of the newer countries in the world, as it were. And although naturally, of course, with a long history, an interesting history. So where is it? I've got a new prop. Yes, a globe. It really helps, I think, to place things if you can look at them on a globe rather than a map, doesn't it? Because you get the proportions right and the relationships between places. So let's find Australia because it's nice and big and easy to find. All right, and if you go sort of just up from Australia here, that is the island of Timor. And Timor is, so if you kind of imagine it's a sort of the Indonesian sort of streak of islands going across here, and the island of Timor is the last of those, and kind of just beneath Borneo and so just down from the Philippines. Yeah, so there we have it. So you might know it as East Timor because that's what it was called for a long time. And interesting history because it it was sort of colonized by waves of prehistoric peoples. We don't know exactly, but it became part of that kind of Indonesian, Malaysian, Philippines sort of zone trading network in historical times. Trading also with China and India because it had sandalwood. So you've got to imagine kind of like local chiefs controlling different parts of the island, but very much interconnected with that sort of that world, that part of the world. And then, of course, as so often, the Europeans come along, us pesky Europeans coming to cause problems, and it was the sandalwood that attracted Europeans to try and get control of Timor, and it was the Dutch and the Portuguese. So the west half of the island was part of the sort of Dutch controlled area, and the Portuguese had the east. Now, that meant that when the Indonesians kind of won independence from the Dutch in 1940 something, 1945, I think, just like at the end of the Second World War, West Timor became part of the new country of Indonesia, but East Timor carried on being a Portuguese colony. And it was always a bit of the back of beyond, and a bit of a neglected colony. I mean, not important to Portugal in the way that sort of Angola and Mozambique, the biggies were, or even Macau, and because of the connection with China, commercially was very important. East Timor was somewhere where people would kind of get exiled to, or people that had been a bit disgraced themselves or were troublesome, they get sent from Portugal or indeed from Angola and Mozambique to East Timor, but they hung on to it, and as Isa explained, um, we have to see that in the context of the fact that Portugal was effectively a dictatorship. No, not effectively, it was a dictatorship, and so it kind of was more rigid and less moved forward less, I suppose, than other um, European colonial powers in the second half of the 20th century. But then in 1974, there was a coup, military coup in Portugal. Dictatorship comes to an end. Portugal's kind of history of a modern European nation kind of starts there. But in East Timor, that meant that they attempted to kind of grasp their independence, but within days, the Indonesians had kind of invaded and taken control of what they saw as the other half of an island that was theirs. That's the context for this book, for the crossing. So and you can need to understand that history for the book to make sense. Um, Now, and I suppose in a big chunk of the time of the book is the 24 years of Indonesian occupation, and after which East Timor, there was a transitional United Nations kind of government, and then it became, say, an independent country in 2002 as Timor Leste. Now, during that time, the kind of narrator of the book, those 24 years, he's actually in exile in Portugal. So the book goes back and forth between Timor and Portugal, as did Luis Cardoso, the author. So he was born in 1958, and it's not a memoir, not literally his memoir, but it is a kind of, it draws very much on his experience of growing up in East Timor under Portuguese control, his experience of, he and the narrator are both get a scholarship to go to Portugal as a student just before the Portuguese Revolution and hence the Indonesian invasion of East Timor. And then, of course, he and the narrator are stuck in exile in Portugal for the next 24 years. And the book actually ends just before East Timor, becomes independent. So we know that as kind of like a coda, like an epilogue to the book. But it was written in 1997, or published in 1997, and translated in 2000, I think. For me, reading books like this from like small places, you can end up, I suppose, I've ended up reading some kind of mighty strange books from places where there isn't a lot available in English because they're a small country without a kind of huge output of literature, and certainly not translated into English. Andorra, for example. From Andorra, I wound up reading a perfectly competent book of historical fiction set in Egypt under the pharaohs. Now, it didn't tell me a lot about Andorra, but I suppose the thing it did tell me about Andorra is that if you live in Andorra, which is probably it's a per capita wealth is huge, and the total population is, I don't know, less than 100,000. You don't need to write a book like this one. You don't need to write a book that is sort of deeply embedded in your country's fraught 20th century history, do you? Because so you can write about ancient Egypt, why not? But hitting a book like this for me is like, it's like being a miner and hitting a seam of gold. This is just what I'm after, I suppose, because Cardoso really does kind of tell the story of East Timor from Second World War to 1997 in this book, through the lives of the father and the son that are the main characters. Now, is it a good book? What did I make of it as a book? I've said it was intensely interesting in terms of content. It was a real curate's egg of a book, real mixed bag. Um, when you're reading something and you hit on a chapter or a passage, a part of that book where the hairs stand up on the back of your neck because it is so well written. There's something about it that just sort of like sends shivers down your spine, and you stop and you think, no, I need to read that bit again more slowly. I need to reread that chapter. I need to embrace that even more thoroughly. This is a book that has bits in it like that. Those kind of bits that are almost like what we read for. On on the other hand, it also had some bits that were really odd, turgid, and disjointed. So I've rarely read a book that was sort of so unbalanced almost in the kind of pleasure or satisfaction or quality for me as a reader. Um, there's a wonderful chapter at the beginning that has a part in it where he's, as a young boy, a very small child, in a boat travelling from the mainland island of East Timor to a small island just off the coast that's used almost like a prison island. And in the boat there's them. His father's a nurse. He's going to be like the medical service for this island. There's a prisoner. There's the boatman who's almost a figure a bit like Karen, paddling souls across the river to hell. A shark approaches the boat, and the boatman says, "Oh, that they're our ancestors. The ancestors of the people that live on this island, embodied in the shark." Um, it's magical. It's not magical as in magical realism. It's actually quite matter of fact, but just draws on those kind of a kind of world of of folklore that was still intensely real and meaningful. Um, Wonderful chapter. There's another bit where he's now in exile in Lisbon and lonely and on his own, and he's sitting by the harbour side of the river in Lisbon, the River Tagus, and two other people from East Timor kind of recognise him as Timorese and approach him, and they're of a really different class. He's a like middle class student. They're on a scholarship. They wound up sort of almost accidentally getting sort of airlifted out to Portugal and scraping a living as labourers. Um, and they catch a bus together and get lost. And then one of the other two men, when they get off this bus, he takes all his clothes off and puts them on back to front, because that's how you trick the evil spirit that's led you astray into not making you carry on being lost. I haven't explained that very well. It's a brilliant moment because you're in like this Lisbon bus with the bus and him, and he's and he, our narrator, is not sure sort of almost how to like whether to be embarrassed at the other people seeing this, or to embrace it, and because these two men are so warm and welcoming and sort of supportive to him. So so lovely moments. On the other hand, there's a whole chunk of this book where he basically goes through like a whole series of people that meant nothing to me. I mean, when someone talked about having to Google read things sometimes. I was Google reading each name that came up. I'd have to go and Google it to understand who it was, and they were all people who'd become important sort of political or guerrilla fighter figures in the sort of East Timorese sort of struggle for independence. But you just kind of like get almost like a kind of potted biography of each of them, but you just don't. You've got nothing to hang on to. There's no plot. You're lost. Now, on reflection, I think some of the sort of quite disjointed sections of the book are partly about he's trying to convey to you the kind of discontinuities that happened in East Timor's history, in that last sort of chunk of the 20th century. And it was almost a memoir, not of himself or the sort of the fictionalized version of him, the main character. It's more like a memoir of the country. And when the country is confused and disjointed, the chapters are confused and disjointed. Yeah. Um, and he's wanting with his political figures, I think, to sort of show how, like lots of them were all school kids together in Jesuit seminaries, because that was the only kind of more advanced secondary education available on the island. You had to go and learn religion with the Jesuits or whatever, and then they could all end up on leading different factions as adults when uh, that part of that struggle, independent struggle was happening, or that you could be like a schoolboy obsessed with football, being like the goalkeeper or whatever, or pop music, and and then move from that to being leading bands of freedom fighters in the mountains in real extreme conditions. um yeah, so he's wanting you to understand that, but it doesn't always make for kind of comfortable or fluid reading, if that makes sense. Now, I think you will gather that this is a strong recommendation from me, this book, regardless of the kind of issues, some of the issues with the book. It's bookended with chapters in Lisbon with that are very sort of poignant with his father, who's also now in exile and is losing his memory. And there's something very, so that the whole thing ultimately coheres, I suppose, despite the very sort of odd bits at times in the middle. And yes, I would wholeheartedly say if you want to understand a bit more about Timor Leste and its past, and read a book that has moments of real kind of literary quality, this is one for you. And thank you so much, Isa, for sharing it with me.